The morning sun blazed mercilessly over the New Mexico territory as dust devils danced across the cracked earth like restless spirits. Thomas Mackenzie adjusted his worn leather hat and urged his buckskin mare forward along the narrow trail that led from Santa Fe back to his isolated ranch. The journey had been fruitless, another month without finding decent hands willing to work his spread for honest wages. Most men preferred the quick money of cattle rustling or the false promises of silver strikes to the steady grind of ranch work. Thomas was a man carved from the harsh landscape itself, weathered face lined by 43 years of desert sun, hands calloused from rope and rain, shoulders broad from hauling feed and mending fence. His pale blue eyes held the particular sadness of a man who had loved deeply and lost completely. 3 years had passed since consumption claimed his wife Sarah, yet he still found himself setting 2 plates at supper, still heard her laughter echoing through the empty rooms of their adobe home. The mare's hooves kicked up small clouds of alkali dust as they crested the ridge overlooking the valley where Mission San Miguel sat like a white jewel against the red earth. Thomas had ridden past the mission countless times, but today something was different. A small crowd had gathered in the courtyard, voices raised in heated discussion. He reined in his horse, squinting against the glare. Below, he could make out the brown robes of the Franciscan friars gesturing animatedly at a slight figure standing apart from the group. Even from this distance, Thomas could see the rigid posture of rejection, the careful stillness that spoke of dignity under assault. His jaw tightened as he recognized the scene. Another soul being turned away from sanctuary. The figure was a young woman, her long black hair braided with colored ribbon that caught the light like captured fire. She wore a simple dress of blue cotton, likely a cast-off from some charitable white woman, but she held herself with the bearing of nobility. Her copper skin marked her as Apache, which explained the mission's reluctance to offer aid. The territorial government's policy toward the Apache had grown increasingly harsh, and even the missions had begun turning away indigenous people to avoid conflict with local authorities. Thomas watched as Father Miguel, the mission's elderly priest, approached the girl with obvious reluctance. The old man's Spanish words carried on the desert wind, formal and apologetic, but final. The girl listened without moving, her face a mask of stoic acceptance. When the priest finished speaking, she simply nodded once and turned to walk away. Something in that gesture, the absolute lack of pleading, the refusal to beg for mercy she clearly needed, struck Thomas like a physical blow. He had seen that same pride in Sarah's eyes during her final illness, the determination to face fate with grace rather than desperation. Without conscious thought, he nudged his mare down the slope toward the mission. The girl had already passed through the mission gates and was walking steadily along the dusty road that led nowhere in particular. Her steps were measured, unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world, rather than being a young woman alone in hostile territory with nowhere to go. Thomas rode alongside her, keeping his horse at a walking pace. "Miss," he called out, touching the brim of his hat. "You heading somewhere particular?" She glanced up at him briefly, her dark eyes assessing, but not afraid. "No place that concerns you, senor." Her English was accented but clear, each word chosen with care. Thomas noted the slight tremor in her hands despite the steadiness of her voice. She was hungry, probably had been for days. "Name's Thomas Mackenzie," he said, dismounting to walk beside her. "I own a spread about 10 miles north of here, always looking for help with the cooking and such." "I do not need charity," she replied, her chin lifting slightly. "Good," Thomas said. "Because I do not give charity. I pay fair wages for honest work. Question is whether you are interested in earning them." She stopped walking and turned to face him fully. In the harsh daylight, he could see she was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 20 years old, with high cheekbones and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his appearance and manner. A thin scar ran from her left temple to her jaw, old and healed but still visible. "Why would you offer work to someone the Holy Fathers will not shelter?" she asked. Thomas adjusted his hat, considering his words carefully. "Because the Holy Fathers answer to territorial authorities, who profit from keeping certain people hungry and desperate. I answer to no one but my conscience and my empty stomach. The latter tells me I need someone who can cook better than beans from a can." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "And your conscience?" Tells me a woman walking alone on this road will be dead or worse by nightfall, and I have seen enough unnecessary death to last several lifetimes. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for deception or hidden motives. Thomas stood still under her scrutiny, letting his mare nibble at the sparse grass beside the road. Finally, she nodded. "My name is Ayana," she said. "It means eternal blossom in my language." "Ayana," Thomas repeated, finding the name fitted her perfectly. "You have experience with cooking and housework?" "I worked for the mission for 2 years before they decided my presence was too dangerous to their standing with the territorial governor. I can cook, clean, tend garden, care for animals. I read and write in Spanish and English." Thomas raised an eyebrow at the last qualification. Literacy was rare enough on the frontier, particularly among women, and doubly so among the Apache. "Where did you learn your letters?" "My father was a scout for the army before the troubles began. He believed education would help his children survive in the white world. He was wrong about many things, but not about the value of knowledge." The sadness in her voice spoke of losses that went far beyond simple displacement. Thomas did not press for details. The frontier was full of people carrying grief too heavy for casual conversation. "Well then, Miss Ayana, if you are willing, I will be glad to have the help. You will have your own room, meals, and $15 a month. Sundays free for whatever worship or rest you prefer." She blinked in surprise. $15 is generous wages for household work. Good help is worth paying for properly. "Do we have an agreement?" She extended her hand in the manner of white businessmen, her grip firm and calloused from hard work. "We have an agreement, Mr. Mackenzie." They rode toward his ranch as the sun climbed higher, Thomas on his mare and Ayana on the spare horse he kept for emergencies. She sat her mount with the easy grace of someone raised around horses, her posture straight but relaxed. They spoke little during the journey, but the silence was comfortable rather than strained. The Mackenzie ranch spread across a natural basin surrounded by low mesas, with a clear stream running through the center of the property. The main house was built of adobe in the Spanish style, with thick walls to keep out the heat and a covered veranda that caught the evening breezes. Outbuildings included a barn, smokehouse, and small bunkhouse that currently stood empty. Perhaps 200 head of cattle grazed in the far pastures, along with a dozen horses in the near corral. "It is beautiful," Ayana said as they approached the house. "Your wife must have loved it here." Thomas felt the familiar pang at the mention of Sarah, but answered calmly. "She did. Spent hours on that veranda watching the sunset paint the mesas purple. She has passed. 3 years ago, consumption. I am sorry for your loss." Thomas nodded, grateful she did not offer empty platitudes about God's will or better places. Death was simply death, and acknowledging it honestly was more comfort than false reassurance. He showed her around the property, pointing out the various buildings and explaining the daily routines. The house tour was brief. A large main room that served as kitchen and parlor, his bedroom, and the smaller room that had been Sarah's retreat when she needed solitude for her sewing or letters. "This will be your room," he said, opening the door to reveal a space filled with afternoon light from 2 windows. A narrow bed stood against one wall, with a washstand, small desk, and chest of drawers completing the furnishings. Sarah's quilting frame still occupied one corner, her last project stretched across it in a pattern of desert flowers. Ayana stepped inside and moved slowly around the room, her fingers trailing along the furniture surfaces. She paused at the quilting frame, studying the intricate needlework. She was skilled, Ayana observed. This pattern tells a story. Sarah always said quilts were books written in thread and color. That one shows the first year we were married. Each flower represents something that happened. The yellow roses were for our wedding, the morning glories for the first cattle we bought, the desert lupines for the year it rained enough to bring wildflowers to the valley. Ayana traced one of the lupine blossoms with her fingertip. "It is beautiful, but perhaps I should not sleep in a room filled with such memories." Thomas considered this. The practical part of him knew she was right. Keeping Sarah's room as a shrine served no one, but letting another woman occupy that space felt like betrayal. "The memories are mine to carry," he said finally. "The room needs to be lived in again. Sarah would not want it to become a museum." That evening, Ayana prepared their first meal together. beans and cornbread elevated by herbs she had gathered along the stream, and seasoned with techniques that spoke of both Apache and Mexican influences. They ate at the kitchen table as the last light faded from the sky, conversation limited to practical matters of schedules and expectations. After supper, Thomas retreated to the veranda with his pipe while Ayana cleaned the dishes. Through the open windows, he could hear her moving around the kitchen with quiet efficiency, occasionally humming what sounded like an Apache lullaby. The sound stirred something in him that had been dormant since Sarah's death. Not desire exactly, but an awareness of feminine presence that both comforted and unsettled him. When she finished her work, Ayana joined him on the veranda. The night air carried the scent of sage and cooling earth, and overhead the stars blazed with the clarity only possible far from cities. She settled into Sarah's old rocking chair without asking permission, as if she understood that some boundaries needed to be crossed gently, rather than observed rigidly. "Tell me about the troubles you mentioned," Thomas said, after they had sat in companionable silence for several minutes. Ayana was quiet for so long, he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the flat tone people use to distance themselves from painful memories. "My band tried to live peacefully near the reservation. We followed the agent's rules, sent our children to the mission school, learned to farm instead of following the buffalo. But peaceful Apache still made white settlers nervous, and nervous settlers complained to territorial officials." She rocked slowly, the chair creaking in rhythm with her words. 3 months ago, soldiers came to move us farther south, to land where nothing grows and the water tastes of alkali. My father protested that we were causing no trouble, had broken no laws. The colonel said the law was whatever kept white people safe, and Apache presence made them feel unsafe. Thomas drew on his pipe, the tobacco glowing red in the darkness. He had heard variations of this story before, had seen the steady erosion of promises made to indigenous peoples. When we refused to leave, they burned our camp. My parents died in the fire. My younger brother was shot trying to save our horses. I escaped only because I was gathering medicinal plants in the mountains and saw the smoke. And after that, I walked for weeks, trying to reach relatives in Mexico. But I became ill from drinking bad water and collapsed near the mission. The friars nursed me back to health, let me work for my keep. For 2 years, I thought I had found a new life. Thomas set down his pipe. What changed? The new territorial governor appointed a commission to investigate mission activities. They decided that sheltering Apache, even converts to Christianity, was contrary to public safety. Father Miguel received orders to cease all aid to indigenous people. The rocking chair stilled. In the starlight, Thomas could see tears glistening on her cheeks, though her voice remained steady. "I understand their fear," she said. "Apache raiders have killed many innocents, but I am not those raiders. I have harmed no one, stolen nothing, threatened no one, yet I am guilty of being born with the wrong blood." Thomas felt anger rising in his chest, not at her, but at the system that reduced human beings to their tribal affiliations and judged them collectively rather than individually. He had served in the army himself, had seen both the brutality of some Apache raids and the equally brutal retaliation by white settlers and soldiers. "You are not guilty of anything except surviving," he said firmly. "And anyone who says different can take it up with me." She turned to look at him, surprise evident in her expression. "You would defend an Apache woman to your neighbors? I would defend anyone in my employ who earns their place honestly. Your blood does not change your character, any more than mine changes the fact that I am sometimes a stubborn fool who talks too much." This brought a small smile to her face, the first genuine one he had seen. It transformed her entirely, revealing the woman she might have been in a world without hatred and fear. "Thank you, Thomas Mackenzie," she said softly. "I will try to be worthy of your faith." "You already are," he replied, meaning it completely. They sat together until the moon rose full and silver over the mesas, each lost in private thoughts but somehow connected by the shared recognition of decency in an indecent world. When Ayana finally rose to go inside, Thomas remained on the veranda, smoking and wondering what he had gotten himself into. Hiring her had been an impulse born of compassion and practical need, but he was beginning to understand that her presence would change his life in ways he had not anticipated. For the first time since Sarah's death, the ranch felt like a home, rather than simply a place where he waited for his own ending. Inside the house, Ayanna prepared for sleep in Sarah's room. She had moved the quilting frame to one side, careful not to disturb the unfinished pattern, and arranged her few possessions with military precision. Kneeling beside the bed, she offered prayers in her native language to ancestors she hoped were listening, asking for guidance and protection in this new chapter of her life. As she settled under Sarah's quilts, Ayanna allowed herself to hope that perhaps Thomas Mackenzie was different from other white men she had known. His kindness seemed genuine rather than paternalistic, his respect offered without expectation of gratitude or subservience. Time would tell whether this sanctuary would prove more lasting than the mission's false promises. Outside, coyotes began their nightly chorus, their voices weaving together in harmonies that spoke of wildness and freedom. Ayanna listened until sleep claimed her, dreaming of desert flowers blooming against all odds in hostile soil. The weeks that followed established a rhythm as natural as the cycle of seasons. Ayanna rose before dawn to tend the kitchen garden she had planted behind the house, coaxing vegetables from the stubborn desert soil with techniques her grandmother had taught her. Thomas would find his breakfast waiting. Eggs from the chickens she had convinced him to buy, fresh bread that filled the house with warmth, coffee strong enough to wake the dead, but smooth as silk. Their conversations over morning meals grew longer and more comfortable. Thomas discovered that Ayanna possessed not only practical intelligence, but genuine curiosity about the world beyond her immediate experience. She asked thoughtful questions about his cattle breeding program, offered suggestions for improving water conservation, and listened with genuine interest to his stories about the early days of territorial settlement. For her part, Ayanna found herself relaxing in ways she had not thought possible since her family's death. Thomas treated her neither as a curiosity nor a charity case, but simply as a competent woman whose contributions were valued. When she mentioned missing the medicinal plants that grew in her homeland, he offered to ride with her into the mountains to search for suitable substitutes. When a late spring storm damaged part of the roof, he asked for her help with repairs, rather than assuming she was incapable of such work. The townspeople of Cedar Flats, the nearest settlement, reacted to Ayanna's presence with predictable suspicion and hostility. During their monthly supply runs, Thomas endured pointed comments about the wisdom of harboring Apache on his property. Sheriff Hawkins, a man whose authority derived more from his willingness to use violence than any legal expertise, made several unsubtle suggestions about the dangers of trusting savages. Thomas responded to these provocations with the patience of a man who had learned to choose his battles carefully. He neither defended Ayanna with passionate speeches, nor allowed the criticism to influence his treatment of her. Instead, he simply continued conducting business as usual, his calm demeanor making it clear that he considered the matter closed to discussion. The real test came on a sweltering afternoon in late June when Thomas and Ayanna were mending fence along the eastern boundary of his property. They worked in companionable silence, he stretching wire while she secured posts, both grateful for the shade provided by a small grove of cottonwoods. The cattle grazed peacefully in the near pasture, their occasional lowing the only sound besides the whisper of wind through leaves. The attack came without warning. 3 riders emerging from the rocks above them like demons materialized from the heat shimmer. Thomas recognized them immediately. Jake Brennan and his 2 cousins, men who survived by rustling cattle and intimidating anyone too weak to resist them. They had been suspected of numerous crimes but never convicted, partly because witnesses had a habit of developing sudden amnesia when it came time to testify. "Well, well," Brennan called out as he rode closer, his horse dancing nervously under tight rein. "If it ain't Mackenzie and his pet squaw. Heard tell you were keeping Apache trash on your spread, but had to see it for myself." Thomas straightened slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle propped against the fence post. "State your business, Jake, then ride on. You are not welcome here." Brennan's smile was the cold expression of a man who enjoyed inflicting pain. "My business is protecting decent white folks from savage murderers. That Apache bitch has got blood on her hands, and everyone knows it." "You are speaking of my employee," Thomas said, his voice deadly quiet. "I suggest you choose your next words more carefully." One of the cousins, a thin man with nervous eyes, urged his horse closer to Ayanna. "Maybe we should take her to town. Let the sheriff decide what to do with her." could be a reward for turning in a wanted Apache. Ayanna had not moved during this exchange, but Thomas could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers tightened around the fence tool she held. Her face remained impassive, but her dark eyes tracked every movement of the three men with the alertness of a cornered animal. "The only thing you boys are going to do," Thomas said conversationally, "is turn those horses around and ride back where you came from. Otherwise, things are likely to get unpleasant." Brennan laughed, a harsh sound like breaking glass. 3 against 1, old man. And we all know you would not shoot white men to protect Apache filth. Thomas smiled then, an expression that never reached his eyes. "You are right about one thing, Jake. I would not shoot white men to protect her." He lifted his rifle in a smooth motion, the barrel centering on Brennan's chest. "I would shoot you to protect my property and my rights as a landowner. The fact that you are threatening my employee is just another reason to put you in the ground." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Brennan's horse sidled nervously, sensing its rider's tension. The two cousins looked uncertain, apparently having expected an easy intimidation rather than armed resistance. In the silence, Thomas could hear his own heartbeat and the soft whisper of Ayanna's breathing. "You are making a mistake, Mackenzie," Brennan said finally, but his bluster carried less conviction than before. "Folks in town are not going to stand for you harboring Apache killers. There will be consequences." "There will indeed," Thomas agreed. "The consequence of you bothering me again will be a bullet through your worthless hide. The consequence of you touching my employee will be a shallow grave in the desert. Are we understanding each other?" For a moment, violence hung in the air like heat lightning before a storm. Then Brennan spat into the dust and yanked his horse's head around. "This ain't over, Mackenzie. You would do well to remember that Apache loyalty goes only as deep as convenience. When trouble comes, and it will come, she will cut your throat and dance on your grave." The three men rode away at a gallop, kicking up clouds of dust that drifted slowly in the still air. Thomas did not lower his rifle until they disappeared over the ridge, and even then he kept it ready across his forearm. "Are you hurt?" he asked Ayanna without looking at her. "No." Her voice was steady, but he could hear the underlying current of emotion. "Thomas, perhaps it would be better if I left. I do not wish to bring trouble to your door." Now he did turn to face her, his blue eyes intense in the afternoon light. "The only trouble here is ignorant men who think they can intimidate their neighbors with threats and bluster. You have done nothing wrong, and I will be damned before I let cowards drive you away from a place you have earned the right to call home." She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of doubt or reservation. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "Thank you, but they will return." "Probably," Thomas agreed. "When they do, we will be ready." That evening, as they shared supper in the kitchen, Thomas outlined the precautions they would need to take. Extra rifles positioned around the house, a system of signals in case of trouble, plans for reaching the nearest neighbor if they needed help. Ayanna listened carefully, asking practical questions and offering suggestions based on her own experience with violence and survival. "You do not have to do this," she said as they finished their planning. "I could disappear into the mountains, find my way to Mexico. You would be safe then." Thomas set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly. "Ayanna, in the 3 months you have been here, this place has felt like a home again, instead of just a house where I wait to die. You have brought life back to rooms that were empty, purpose to work that had become mere routine. If you think I am going to let a few bullies drive away the best thing that has happened to me since Sarah died, you do not know me very well." Color rose in her cheeks at his words, and for a moment she seemed younger, more vulnerable. "Thomas, I know," he said gently. "You are afraid to trust happiness, because you have lost everything before. So am I. But fear is not a reason to throw away something good when we find it." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, her touch warm and certain. "Then we face whatever comes together." "Together," he agreed. The attack came 3 nights later, just after midnight when the moon was dark and the desert lay wrapped in profound silence. Thomas woke to the soft touch of Ayanna's hand on his shoulder, her whispered warning bringing him instantly alert. "Riders," she breathed. "At least 6, coming from the north." He rolled out of bed and grabbed his rifle, grateful for the hours they had spent preparing. Ayanna had already moved to her assigned position by the kitchen window, her own weapon ready. Through the thick adobe walls, they could hear the soft jingle of harness, the creak of leather, the whispered commands of men trying to move quietly. The first shot shattered the night silence, the bullet punching through the wooden shutters of the main room window. Thomas returned fire immediately, aiming at the muzzle flash rather than trying to identify specific targets in the darkness. More shots followed, some striking the house, others going wide. "Behind the barn!" Ayanna called out, her rifle cracking as she fired at movement in the shadows. Thomas could see them now, dark figures darting between the outbuildings, using the corrals and water trough for cover. They were trying to surround the house, cut off any escape routes. He recognized Brennan's voice shouting orders, along with several others he did not know. More men than he had expected, which meant word of the Apache woman had spread beyond the immediate area. "Burn them out!" someone yelled. "Fire will flush the Apache bitch!" Thomas felt ice form in his stomach. Fire was the one thing their adobe walls could not protect against. If the attackers managed to set the roof ablaze, he and Ayanna would be forced into the open where superior numbers would quickly overwhelm them. A torch arced through the darkness, landing on the roof of the barn. The dry wood caught immediately, flames spreading with terrifying speed. Another torch followed, this one aimed at the house itself, but falling short to sputter out in the dirt of the yard. "We have to move," Thomas called to Ayanna. "They will have the whole place burning soon." She nodded, understanding immediately. They had discussed this possibility, planned for it. The question was whether they could reach the rocky outcrop behind the house before the attackers closed their circle completely. Thomas fired 3 quick shots to keep the besiegers honest, then grabbed his saddlebags and the spare ammunition. Ayanna was already moving toward the back door, her rifle and a canvas pack slung over her shoulder. They paused at the threshold, listening for sounds of movement in the darkness beyond. "Ready?" Thomas whispered. She squeezed his arm in response, and together they slipped out into the night. The run to the rocks seemed to take forever, though it could not have been more than 30 seconds. Every step expected a bullet. Every shadow might hide an enemy. But their luck held, and they reached the shelter of the stone outcrop just as shouts indicated their absence from the house had been discovered. From their vantage point among the rocks, they could see the full scope of the attack. At least 8 men surrounded the burning buildings, while more waited with horses at the edge of the firelight. The barn was fully engulfed now, the flames reaching toward the star-filled sky like grasping fingers. The house still stood, but Thomas could see men with torches moving closer. "There!" one of the attackers shouted, pointing toward their hiding place. "In the rocks!" Bullets began striking the stone around them, chipping off fragments that stung like angry wasps. Thomas returned fire methodically, making each shot count. Beside him, Ayanna worked her rifle with calm precision, her training from childhood hunts serving her well in this deadlier game. The siege continued for what felt like hours but was probably less than one. The attackers had superior numbers but were exposed in the firelight, while Thomas and Ayanna enjoyed both cover and concealment among the rocks. Gradually, the enthusiasm of the besiegers began to wane as casualties mounted and the expected easy victory failed to materialize. "This ain't worth dying for," someone called out. "Let's get out of here before the army shows up." Thomas heard the sound of horses moving, men calling to each other as they prepared to withdraw. But Brennan's voice cut through the confusion like a knife. "Nobody leaves until that Apache whore is dead. She killed my brother at Dove Creek, and I mean to see her pay." Thomas felt Ayanna stiffen beside him. Dove Creek had been a massacre 3 years earlier, an Apache raid that left 17 settlers dead, including women and children. If Brennan truly believed Ayanna had been involved, no amount of reasoning would satisfy his need for vengeance. The final assault came just before dawn, when exhaustion and dwindling ammunition had worn down their defenses. Brennan led the charge personally, his remaining men following with the desperate courage of those who knew retreat was no longer possible. They came up the slope in a ragged line, firing as they advanced, using darkness and speed to close the distance. Thomas met them with steady rifle fire, but there were too many targets and too little time. A bullet grazed his shoulder, spinning him around and nearly knocking the weapon from his hands. Another shattered the stock of Ayanna's rifle, leaving her with only the pistol Thomas had insisted she carry. Brennan reached the rocks first, his face twisted with hatred and exhaustion. He raised his rifle toward Ayanna, murder blazing in his eyes. Thomas threw himself sideways, trying to spoil the shot, knowing he was too late, too slow. The rifle crack echoed off the stone walls, but it was Brennan who fell, a red flower blooming on his shirt front. Behind him, Sheriff Hawkins lowered his smoking weapon, his weathered face grim in the firelight. "Should have listened when I told you to leave it alone, Jake," the sheriff said quietly. The remaining attackers froze, caught between their desire for revenge and the sudden appearance of legal authority. Hawkins was not a good man by any reasonable standard, but he was scrupulously honest about enforcing territorial law within his jurisdiction. "Drop your weapons," Hawkins commanded. "All of you. This foolishness ends now." One by one, the rifles hit the ground. Thomas kept his own weapon ready but did not aim it at anyone in particular. Beside him, Ayanna slowly holstered her pistol, her dark eyes never leaving the sheriff's face. "Mackenzie," Hawkins said without turning around. "You and the woman come down here. We need to talk." They descended from the rocks cautiously, ready to dive for cover if the situation changed suddenly. But the fight had gone out of the attackers with Brennan's death, and they stood in a dejected cluster, waiting to learn their fate. "Anybody else hurt bad?" Hawkins asked, looking around the group. 2 men nursed minor wounds, but nothing that required immediate medical attention. The sheriff nodded and began issuing orders with the efficiency of long practice. "Morrison, you and your boy ride to town and fetch the undertaker for Jake. Tell Doc Wilson to come out here too, just in case. Rest of you mount up and ride out. If I see any of you within 10 miles of this place again, I will assume you are planning more trouble and act accordingly." The men dispersed quickly, clearly relieved to escape more serious consequences. Within minutes, only Thomas, Ayanna, and the sheriff remained among the smoldering ruins of the ranch buildings. Hawkins looked around at the destruction with professional detachment, then turned his attention to Thomas. "You want to tell me what this was about?" "Jake Brennan decided my hiring practices were his business," Thomas replied carefully. I disagreed. "Uh-huh." The sheriff's eyes moved to Ayanna, cataloging her appearance and demeanor. "And you, miss, you got anything to add?" "Only that Mr. Mackenzie treated me fairly and defended me when others would not," she said quietly. Hawkins studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Jake claimed you were at Dove Creek. That true?" Thomas tensed, ready to intervene. But Ayanna answered calmly. "No, Sheriff. 3 years ago I was working at Mission San Miguel, learning to read Spanish from Father Miguel. He will confirm this if you ask him." "Might just do that," Hawkins mused. He looked around at the burned buildings again, then back at Thomas. "You planning to rebuild?" "If I can," Thomas replied. "This is my home." "And the lady? She planning to stay on?" Thomas glanced at Ayanna, suddenly aware that everything they had built together, the fragile trust, the growing affection, the sense of belonging, might not survive this night of violence. She had every reason to flee, to seek safety in anonymity rather than remain a target for future attacks. "That," Thomas said quietly, "is entirely up to her." Ayanna looked at the ruins of the barn, at the house with its shattered windows and bullet-scarred walls, at the blood-stained ground where men had died over nothing more than the color of her skin. Then she looked at Thomas, seeing past his wounds and exhaustion to the man who had risked everything to give her a place to belong. "I have nowhere else to go," she said simply, "and no one else who would have me. If you will have me still, this is where I choose to stay." Thomas felt something tight in his chest loosen and expand, like a held breath finally released. "Then we rebuild," he said. "Together." Sheriff Hawkins nodded once, apparently satisfied with their answers. "I will file a report claiming this was an attempted robbery that went wrong. Jake always was too fond of other people's cattle for his own good. Nobody is likely to ask difficult questions about his death." He mounted his horse and paused, looking down at them with something that might have been respect. "For what it is worth, Mackenzie, you did right by her. Takes a man with backbone to stand up to a mob, especially when he has got nothing to gain by it." After the sheriff left, Thomas and Ayanna stood together in the growing dawn light, surveying the damage to their home. The barn was completely destroyed, the house damaged, but salvageable. Most of the livestock had scattered during the fighting, though some would probably return when hunger overcame fear. "It will take months to rebuild," Thomas said, calculating the cost in time and money. "Yes," Ayanna agreed, "but we have months. We have time. She moved closer to him, close enough that he could smell the scent of sage in her hair, feel the warmth radiating from her body. When she looked up at him, he saw something in her eyes that had not been there before. Not just gratitude or friendship, but something deeper and more dangerous. "Thomas," she said softly, "when you spoke to the sheriff about having me still, did you mean only as your employee?" He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. "I meant," he said carefully, "in whatever way you would have me. As employer, as friend, as—" She silenced him with a kiss that tasted of gunpowder and hope, her arms circling his neck as if she intended never to let him go. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the eastern sky had begun to blush with the colors of sunrise. "As husband," she whispered against his lips, "if you will have a stubborn rancher who talks too much and has more enemies than sense." Her laughter was like music after the night of violence and fear. "I will have him," she said. "On one condition. Name it. When we rebuild, we build something new. Not a replacement for what was lost, but something that belongs to both of us. A home for the family we choose to become." Thomas kissed her again, longer this time, tasting the promise of tomorrows he had not dared to imagine. Around them, the desert began to stir with morning life. Birds calling from the remaining trees, cattle lowing in the distance, the whisper of wind through the ruins carrying the scent of rain clouds building on the horizon. They had lost buildings, livestock, the sense of safety that comes from anonymity. But they had gained something more valuable, the knowledge that their love was strong enough to survive the worst hatred could throw at them. As they walked hand in hand toward the damaged house, planning the work that lay ahead, both understood that they were no longer simply survivors of their respective tragedies. They were builders of something new, something that honored the past while embracing an uncertain but hopeful future. And in the growing light of a New Mexico morning, that seemed like miracle enough for any two people brave enough to claim it.